Wonderful. Well, it's great to see all these folks gathered again together for the history happy hour. I got my trusted huzzah cup. Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. Huzzah is such a great word. You have to say it 3 times. So huzzah. We'll get started. And as Liz said, we're picking up where we left last time, where we left off. And there was something of a cliffhanger. We had Cincinnatus himself pondering, whether he would ever re-enter American public life. And spoiler alert, he did. And that's why we have another talk tonight. So I'll just get everything situated here for a second. All right. So we're gonna jump in and Washington is a great figure to teach with because his life covered all these sort of major periods. His early life covers the height of the British Empire in North America. Uh, Sort of middle years cover the American Revolutionary era, including the Philadelphia Convention, the making of the Constitution, and then, of course, at the end of his life, we get the first presidency. So I did my homework again. I read my teaks this week, and we might have more than this, but we have George Washington, obviously. We have Thomas Jefferson making an appearance. We have Thomas Paine. We have major domestic problems faced by the leaders of the new republic, including maintaining national security and a stable economic system. We're going to have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and we're going to have a little bit of the foreign policy of Washington as well as his farewell address. So we're going to pack all of that in. Some of it will be in the primary source discussion. And I think, my argument here is in the title, and that is that I think George Washington, more than anyone else, is really responsible for the presidency as we know it today. We call him the transformational leader of the presidency. That means really someone who created the office. And it wasn't just because he was first. We can play a little bit of history happy hour trivia and think about who was the first Chief Justice of the United States. Uh, that was John Jay. But we wouldn't really call him the transformational leader of that office. That would be John Marshall, who came later. So it wasn't inevitable that Washington would shape this office so much. Let's see, get my clicker going. All right, so this is our lineup for tonight. We're going to start by talking about the president as the head of state. This is the symbolic role of the presidency. And one unique thing about the American presidency is it combines many roles that in other governmental systems take more than one person. So if we think about just Great Britain, for an example, the head of state is the monarch, and then the prime minister is the chief executive. But the American president actually fills both of those roles and makes it especially interesting and complex office for that reason. So if we go to the Philadelphia Convention, we have to remember that in revising the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive in that form of government. And so the American people were taking a big leap from no executive to what was a very strong office for the 18th century. Take a second, think in your mind about the president's superpowers, the legal ones, the constitutional ones. And some of the things that might come to mind is that the president was and is commander in chief. The president can veto bills of Congress. If you still teach with Schoolhouse Rock, poor Bill, he gets up the steps of Capitol Hill just to get kicked down. The president can pardon people. So these powers were actually kingly monarchical powers in the 18th century. The only other person that had these powers was actually the other George, King George III in Britain, the head of a constitutional monarch. And just to give an example, the English monarchy had not vetoed laws of parliament dating back to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. There was a sense that it would create a constitutional crisis if they did that. So they were giving the American president powers that even a king wouldn't use. By the way, George III did try to veto a parliamentary bill in the 1790s, and sure enough, it caused a constitutional crisis in Britain. So part of Washington's leadership challenge is going to be managing this very powerful office, just as he had the commander of the American troops in the Revolutionary War. And yeah, I'll stop there because we got so much more good stuff. Now everybody thought he was going to be president, but we talked about this a little bit last time. Washington was the homebody that didn't get to be home. He did get to be home during these years, right? Between the Revolutionary War and the start of the presidency, 1783 to 1789. And it was hard to pull him back. Cincinnatus never had a second act. But all these people write to him, Gouverneur Morris and John Jay and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and they say basically that we created this office with you in mind in Philadelphia in 1787. You have to do this job. And so they eventually convinced him to do that. And Washington comes into this job with quite a bit of executive experience, we might say. He had been, obviously the general in the Revolutionary War, and he's the head of this massive plantation at Mount Vernon. By the time of his death, it had 8,000 acres. If you visit Mount Vernon today, it just has 500 acres, and it feels very big. And of course, Washington was an enslaver, and the majority of people at Mount Vernon were enslaved. And just to give you an example, this picture of Mount Vernon we have is the very first image ever done fully of Mount Vernon. And I love, if you look very closely in the background, you can see some enslaved people. And I'll give you a little bit of a close up on it if you look at the detail there. So we have the Washington family out on the Bowling Green, but in the background, you see those workers. And I think that's a great just example of how, even in this space where they were, tried to be hidden, Washington tried to keep them hidden. That was just impossible because they were so integral to Mount Vernon. And I'll talk a little bit more about slavery in the presidency a little bit later, especially in the primary source session. So Washington, they finally convince him to come. He takes this 8-day trip from Alexandria, Virginia, his home community, to New York, which was the seat of the government at the time. He's ferried across, New York Harbor in this ship. You can see this boat with 13 oarsmen to represent all the United States. So there's a lot of celebration. One senator, complained at this point that it was just ceremonies, endless ceremonies. And I guess one clever thing Washington did is he channeled all this adulation for him into support for this new government, which was very much an experiment. And so he's inaugurated in New York at the end of April 1789. We have these lifelike images from Mount Vernon that can be a little bit creepy and scary because they're so real, kind of like Disney World, with the animatrons that talk to you. And so, this role was brand new. It wasn't clear what he was supposed to do. Was he supposed to give a speech? You know, uh, it wasn't really clear. So he decides to do that. And he dressed for the occasion. If you look closely at his clothes, he decided that this new role, this new president, had to wear clothes that were made in America, made in the United States. And this is a close-up of his suit. And this was a real contrast to the monarchy in Britain. So this is what George wore at his coronation in 1760. And some scholars will argue that the American Revolution didn't have great consequences. There wasn't a great change, and I would just submit these different clothes to say that that's not the case. But in terms of his speech, Washington worked on a speech. Turned out to be more than 70 pages, handwritten, and he, fortunately sent it to James Madison to review. And James Madison called it a strange production. And he basically said, whatever you do, don't give this speech. And he didn't. Madison actually helped him write a new speech. And the previous speech was really modeled on what the king would say in opening the session of Parliament, and would kind of give a legislative agenda. And we we now know that usually the inaugural address doesn't do that. That's more for the State of the Union. Uh, and the other kind of strange thing about this, it was kind of defensive. Washington said that he wasn't in this for himself. He didn't have, any heirs. He didn't have any sons. He didn't even want to be paid, but Congress insisted that he be paid for this job. And we have just a little bit of this first draft of his inaugural address, just, literally pieces, because the first editor of Washington's papers in the 19th century actually cut up pieces of the address and gave them to people when they asked for some kind of, remembrance or relic of Washington. So the editors of Washington's papers have literally been trying to piece together this document. So I call it the holy grail of Washington documents, that lost inaugural address. So he gives the address. And, as I said, presentation is very important. That's really key to being the head of state. And, he doesn't wear his ripped jeans for the entire presidency. He eventually settles on this pretty nice velvet suit made in London. And this is one of our primary sources, and we're going to talk more about it at the end. So I'm going to save that for now. But I will just sort of share that Washington still wore his military uniform occasionally as president. Again, he's the very first one. He's still known as general. And one of the things he wanted to do was unite the new United States quite literally by traveling to all 13 states. And he does this with a tour of the northern states in the fall of 1789 and the southern states in the spring of 1791. And he learned on this tour, almost like an aging rock band, that the people wanted the hits. The people wanted his greatest hits. They didn't want to hear his new album. They didn't want to see his London velvet suit. They wanted to see him in the buff and blue, his Continental Army uniform. So outside of these towns, he would suit up into his old uniform, get on his white horse, the white charger, and ride into town, and people loved it. And so he did this in Charleston, and the people were so moved that they wanted a painting of Washington's visit to Charleston. And so they asked the artist John Trumbull to make a painting for them. And this is what Trumbull produced: George Washington at Trenton. And John Trumbull, famous American artist, thought this was the greatest painting he had ever done. But the people of Charleston were not very satisfied. And the reason why is because they wanted George Washington at Charleston. And Trumbull told them, well, George Washington was not at Charleston during the Revolutionary War. And that's why I gave you George Washington at Trenton. And they said, well, that might be the case, but he was here. He was here. We saw him in his uniform just a little while ago. And so Trumbull went back, and, patrons can be very demanding. He produced a new painting for them, George Washington at Charleston. And you can see that the subtitle of this painting might be Trumbull's Revenge, because the backside of the horse is featured rather prominently. And you can see this painting to this day in the City Hall of Charleston. So the bigger point is that, Washington is inventing this office. He's kind of making up as he goes, and part of this, certainly had to do with style in being the head of state. Now, he did have a job manual of sorts, what we call the U.S. Constitution, that he could refer to, and he did, and tried to follow that, but it didn't answer every question, and we'll see that. So first of all, we have Washington's Constitution. And when I say we, I mean Mount Vernon has George Washington's Constitution. And this went for a cool just about $10 million in auction in 2013. And it's the real treasure of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon today. And one reason that it was so pricey is if you look on the right-hand side, I'll try to use my cursor here, you see some faint pencil marks. Washington went through the Constitution and he wrote powers, president, and required under different things that he was supposed to do. And so in many ways, this is the definition of constitutional government, because Washington was saying, I do these things, but I don't do that other stuff, right? And that's one reason that's considered so valuable. and why at night at Mount Vernon, I'm pretty sure that only Nicolas Cage and Doug Bradburn, the CEO of Mount Vernon, know where this book goes. I've only seen it a few times, but a Humanities Texas special for the History Happy Hour, I was able to check it out. I got it right here, Washington, and it's even got the original 18th century post-it notes, got Washington's writing on it. Just Liz, we can't release this video. The FBI might find out, but I do have a wonderful facsimile of Washington's Constitution. So a fun teaching tool that you can actually get from Mount Vernon, and maybe other booksellers. So the Constitution, like I said, didn't answer everything. And one of the things it didn't say is what to call the president. And that's something that the first vice president was really obsessed with, and that was John Adams. And John Adams had been a diplomat in Europe, and he thought that the president should have a resounding title, of some sort. He thought His Highness, his mightiness, even his Republican Majesty, all these different titles that Adams came up with, and as vice president. Think about, like, what would you do as vice president if that was your job? Well, if you looked at the Constitution, you would say, "Oh, I'm president of the Senate." So Adams had the Senate debate this for the first 2 weeks that it met. This is what the Senate spent its time doing. Word got out to the press, and pretty soon people started calling Adams his rotundity. It was also suggested that we should just call all presidents Washington. So there would have been Washington 1, Washington 2. We'd be up to Washington 46 right now. Well, we know now that Washington wasn't very happy about this. That he was very satisfied with just a plain title, a Republican title of president, and made sure that the House of Representatives basically killed this effort that started in the Senate. And I think this shows that he had a real political sensibility. Incidentally, the president was not called Mr. President until pretty far into the 19th century. So that's not something that Washington would have been called. So in the House of Representatives, Washington's main lieutenant was the leader of the House at the time, James Madison, who is probably most famous for being the father of the Constitution. And that first Congress was incredibly productive. They really outlined all kinds of things: the first revenue bills, the judiciary, and they also passed. They actually passed 12 amendments to the Constitution, 10 of which were initially ratified, and we call the Bill of Rights. And these include, of course, the First Amendment, which includes freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and that became very significant on Washington's actually second tour of the North. He went back in 1790, in the summer of 1790, because Rhode Island initially did not ratify the Constitution. So he skipped Rhode Island on his first tour. On his second tour, he stopped there, including at the Toro Synagogue, which is the oldest synagogue in the United States in Newport, Rhode Island. And there he talked about freedom of religion with the Jewish congregation. And we're going to talk more about this in the primary source session as well, including we're going to try our hand at cursive. We're going to see if we can read George Washington's original letter. So there might be a generational divide with that, I'm guessing, in terms of how much luck that we have. But this is a good example of how Washington was really acting constitutionally. Even before the First Amendment was ratified, it was something that he certainly strongly believed in, was freedom of religion. So he's using the Constitution. He's trying to figure out what he does as president. And one of his innovations was to create the cabinet. The cabinet is not actually in the Constitution. So I want to talk a little bit about that and what we might call his own team of rivals, folks that didn't necessarily always agree on his cabinet. So first of all, here's a picture of the cabinet. We have Washington, of course. We have Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War; Alexander Hamilton Standing, Secretary of the Treasury; Thomas Jefferson, first Secretary of State; and Edmund Randolph, the Attorney General, who was also included in the cabinet. Notice who's not there. No John Adams, right? No Mr. Rotundity. And part of this is that Washington didn't really understand the role of vice president. He wasn't sure if it was a legislative position because that person was president of the Senate or executive. And it took a while for that office to really come into its own. I particularly like this image because there's no group of people less likely to have a rap battle than these men. The way that they're portrayed right here. So we now know through the research of the historian Lindsay Travinsky, who's now the director of the library that I've mentioned at Mount Vernon, that Washington's idea for the cabinet likely came from the war councils he used in the Revolutionary War. So this is an example of a room where his aides de camp would have met during the war. And he would gather his officers together and ask for advice, deliberate. And he really seemed to bring that same idea into the American presidency. The figure that became the most dominant in that cabinet was Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, who, because of the musical Hamilton, has probably become, maybe just next to Washington, our most famous founder in the 21st century, and wanted a very powerful commercial economy and eventually industrial economy that resembled Great Britain. And so this was very controversial because the United States had fought the war against Britain, and then all of a sudden, one of its leading statesmen is saying, "Hey, we should really follow the economic playbook of Great Britain." And Hamilton's ideas included a national debt, which he thought would help to unify the country and allow it to do things that it couldn't do otherwise. A national bank in order to manage the national debt, but also to create investments in the economy. You can't have a central government without revenue, right? You can't have a debt unless you pay off the interest. So he also proposed a series of taxes, including on distilled spirits, whiskey, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And like I said, he wanted a manufacturing economy. So again, this was very controversial because it looked very British. The British had the Bank of England, and so I'm proposing a national bank in particular. It looked like Hamilton was following, the British, and it was also required some constitutional interpretations that, were somewhat flexible. That there's, the national bank's not mentioned in the Constitution, so this is something that Hamilton proposed. Washington eventually agreed with him, but it really took all the way till John Marshall's decision in 1819 to really confirm that that's something that that could happen, that things not exactly in the Constitution could be created in the spirit of the powers that were in the executive. So the person that was the most opposed to all of this was the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, and you see his home of Monticello here, favored an agricultural economy. He thought that uh, owning one's own land was the only real path to independence, and he thought working that land created incredible virtue. And of course, this is very hypocritical because Jefferson is doing very little of his own farming at Monticello. It's enslaved laborers who were doing that labor. But his differences were strong enough with Hamilton's that he felt that he had to create a new political first faction and then party called the Democratic Republicans to oppose Hamilton's Federalists, the original party in the United States. And scholars often refer to these first two parties as proto parties because they were just out to annihilate one another. They didn't necessarily believe in a healthy, functioning two-party system. They felt that there should be one party and the ones should destroy the other. And this is important for us to think about in this election season, that to have a healthy party system, you have to recognize the right of your opponent to at least exist and provide opposition. And this is a term referred to as the loyal opposition. and America certainly got off to a rocky start in this rivalry. So this is all happening, in Washington's cabinet, and it disturbed him very much because he was against political parties. He thought that they were self-interested, that they did not, um, contribute to the common good in America. We talked a little bit about this last time that, in sort of Republican theory, smaller Republican theory, the key was selfless service to the nation and the common good. And he thought political parties prevented that. So, to give you a sense of the president's house in Philadelphia, and this actually comes from Texas. This is from the SMU Center for Presidential History, along with Lindsay Travinsky. This building no longer exists in Philadelphia. So, after uh, the seat of government is in New York to start, it moves pretty quickly to Pennsylvania for the rest of Washington's presidency. And that was while the new federal city was being created along the Potomac, what would become Washington City and Washington, D.C. So this is this building. And we also have a recreation of what the cabinet room would look like. And it's a pretty small space. And they had these vigorous debates about the direction of the United States. Washington, with his cabinet for well into the second year of his presidency, he was just getting advice through writing. He would send out queries to his cabinet members, but then they actually did begin to meet in person in this space, and eventually had 99 meetings. And I'm guessing Washington wasn't keeping track because if you were at 99, you would think, why not one more, George? One more cabinet meeting and you'll be at 100. But this is the beginning of really the way the executive branch would be managed, for presidents to this day. So that just gives you kind of a sample of the politics of the period, the cabinet, all these different personalities that Washington is managing. And now let's just kind of get into some of the issues that he dealt with. The first term, the biggest issue I think was just launching the federal government, making it work, and he gave a lot of credibility to it because remember that you know this was a new office with vast powers, and there's a lot of evidence going back to the Philadelphia Convention that they wouldn't have given this you know these powers just to anyone. But Washington had a lot of trust with the American people because he had shown he could give up power. But things would get a little rockier in his second term, and this is among his many precedents. This is another one. Usually, second terms in American history for presidents are more difficult than the first, and that certainly happened for him. So his overall presidency coincided almost exactly with the French Revolution. So Washington becomes president in April of 1789. The storming of the Bastille, the prison in Paris that was detested and associated with this, this absolutist government, the state. It was stormed in July of 1789, so just a few months after Washington was president. And there was a lot of hope that the French Revolution was really kind of following in the mold of the American Revolution. And Washington and other Americans celebrated the French Revolution. And the Marquis de Lafayette, who we talked about last time, ends up being one of the early leaders of the French Revolution. He goes back to France, and he has a key to the Bastille sent to Washington. And it's fun. One of the couriers is Thomas Paine, the writer of Common Sense, who also participated in the French Revolution. And Washington is so proud of this, he displayed it in the executive residence in Philadelphia. And then after the presidency, he brought it back to Mount Vernon. And it's been in the same place at Mount Vernon since Washington's life. There's only three objects at Mount Vernon that really three major objects that have never left. This key to the Bastille, Washington's globe, and a sculpted bust done by the French sculptor Houdin. These are the three, I think most prized objects in many ways at Mount Vernon. Well, Washington and other Americans began to sour on the French Revolution as it became more and more radical. And in 1793, the Reign of Terror happens, and King Louis the 16th and his queen Marie Antoinette both lose their heads. And it's in 1793 that France also goes to war with Britain. And this is a massive global war that's going to last about 20 years, the French Revolutionary and eventually Napoleonic Wars. And America faced this crucial decision because they had been allies with France in the Revolutionary War. They still had treaties with France. And so when this war began, the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, the followers of Jefferson, really supported France and wanted America to support France in these wars. Washington wasn't so sure. And he ultimately decided that America should stay neutral. And he issued a proclamation of neutrality. And this set another precedent where presidents can actually back out of international treaties. And that's essentially what the Washington administration did. And their rationale was that, their treaty was with the guy whose head was rolling on the ground, right? That was the old regime, not this new revolutionary government. So this is another example of how Washington really innovated and created this office and the powers that it has to this day. So another outstanding issue was America's relationship with Great Britain, which wasn't so great. It wasn't terrific after the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of controversial issues. The British continued to occupy forts in what we call the Old Northwest, so places like Detroit and Michilimackinac and Niagara, all these places that had been French forts, and the British had won in the 7 Years' War. They continued to stay there, and they continued to arm Native Americans and engage in the fur trade. And this was a real embarrassment for the United States. So there was that issue. There was also the issue that more than close to 20,000 enslaved African Americans had gained their freedom from the British during the Revolutionary War and actually had been evacuated at the end of the war by the British. The Americans felt like they should be compensated for those people, and that never happened. On the British side, they were very unhappy with the way the American state governments had treated loyalists. People had been loyal to the British, and they thought, that they needed to be compensated for money that they had lost. And amidst all this, in this war against France, the British were seizing American ships and impressing American sailors into service into the British Royal Navy, claiming that they were actually British subjects and not American citizens. So while all this is going on, Washington decides that there needs to be some kind of deal with Great Britain. This needs to end, or it's going to, turn into war. And so he sent this handsome gentleman that we already talked about this evening, the non-transformational leader of the Supreme Court, the first Chief Justice John Jay, who also happened to be one of the real effective and strongest diplomats that America had. And he comes back with a deal that becomes known as the Jay Treaty. And it was incredibly unpopular. This is how unpopular the Jay Treaty was. Jay was hung in effigy, and when you share that kind of term with the students, I guess you have to really emphasize it wasn't Jay himself. It was like mannequins. It was dummies of Jay. At least he had a sense of humor about it. He said that he could walk the entire eastern seaboard by the light of his own effigy being burned. And the reason that the deal was so unpopular is that Jay had gotten almost no concessions from the British. The only thing they had agreed to do is leave the forts in the Northwest territories. And at this point, their Native American allies had been defeated by an American army under General Anthony Wayne, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So that didn't seem like a great concession. And so it seemed like he'd really sold out to the British. But Washington stood by this treaty because it created peace with Britain, at the very least, and it opened up some additional economic opportunities that America did not have before the deal came. And so we see Washington really risking his political capital here. Well, the House of Representatives was so unhappy with the treaty that they refused to, fund certain parts of it unless Washington turned over the documents from the negotiation. Now, a little more history, happy hour trivia for you. Think about the Constitution and which branch of Congress is involved in diplomacy. Um, and it's not the House, right? It's the Senate that provides advice and consent to different treaties. And Washington said, I was at the Philadelphia Convention, and I know the House of Representatives is not privy to these diplomatic papers. And so he refused to turn them over. And we consider this the first example of executive privilege. So again, Washington setting a precedent, um, as president. So the problems continued. So while the stuff with Great Britain is going on, uh, Washington also had protesters in Western Pennsylvania who were really furious with Hamilton's tax on whiskey. And so there's, the label here says the famous whiskey insurrection. It's better known as the Whiskey Rebellion. And that's actually a term that Hamilton came up with himself. And imagine this, that thousands of protesters are gathering, and you have this new government. And what are you supposed to do? Well, Washington decides to amass a very large army, like a huge army at the time, 13,000 men. And he asked permission from the Supreme Court if he could actually do this. And then he marches them half the way to Pittsburgh, where the protesters were concentrated in Western Pennsylvania. So once again, the only American president to wear a uniform and actually command men in the field. He turned back before the rest of the army went to Pittsburgh. Fortunately, they were able to quell the protests peacefully. There's more than 100 arrests, but Washington showed a lot of clemency. He ends up pardoning the two most serious cases, men who were accused and seemed to be guilty of treason potentially. So he saved their life. Uh, but historians still debate about, it turned out okay, but did Washington overreact? Was this executive overreach? I think you could set up a pretty interesting debate with your students about this. And so because of all these different actions, allying with Britain instead of France through the Jay Treaty, um, having the proclamation of neutrality, his reaction to the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington actually got a lot of criticism in his second term. I think a lot of people don't realize this. And one of his chief critics was his old friend, Thomas Paine, a person who, had written Common Sense. He was actually part of the Continental Army under Washington for a while. He had a great nickname. His nickname was Private Common Sense. He wrote something called The American Crisis. You probably heard these words before, that these are the times that try men's souls. That's the opening words to The American Crisis. He actually dedicated his pamphlet, The Rights of Man, to Washington, but he became very bitter about what was happening. And in 1796, on Washington's birthday, no less, he wrote a bitter open letter to Washington. And I'll just give you an example of some of the language. He said, elevated to the chair of the presidency, you assumed the merit of everything to yourself. You commenced your presidential career by encouraging and swallowing the grossest adulation. As to you, sir, treacherous in private friendship and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. Oh gosh, that hurts, doesn't it? That's Paine had a way with words, right? The British knew that, and and Washington learned it. Um, and and so this gives you a sample of the criticism that took place. So, by the end of his second term, Washington was definitely ready to step down. He actually was ready at the end of his first term. I think we talked a little bit last week about how he's always trying to retire. That he wrote an address at the end of the Revolutionary War, the circular letter to the states. That was considered his first farewell address. He actually wrote a second farewell address at the end of his first term with James Madison, but he ended up sticking around. And so he wrote his third farewell address, and this is what we call Washington's farewell address. the end of his second term. He wrote it with Alexander Hamilton, and he had it published in a Philadelphia newspaper. And this is how it looked. This is the original publication. And you can see he was known as General Washington more than President Washington. And then he rode back to Mount Vernon on the exact same day so that nobody could convince him to stay on and be president. And I'm sure that many of you teach this document, and I'd love to talk about it more. And if anybody has any questions or wants to share some of the things they do, that would be great. It's most famous today for a couple of Washington's cautions. One was against partisanship and political parties. The other was against America becoming involved in foreign wars. And it's important to just kind of point out that scholars look at this, I think, in a different way than maybe sometimes it's taught. When Washington's warning against political parties, they already existed. I've talked about how the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson already existed. So in a kind of funny and ironical kind of way, Washington is being very partisan and saying not to be partisan because he's almost saying that, hey, this political opposition, you shouldn't actually exist. And in terms of the wars, he's not saying that America should be isolationist or not get involved in war ever, but he's really focused on those French Revolutionary Wars that were happening at the time. And he says that commercially, America should be very connected to the world. Just one last thought, and this could be kind of a fun question to ask your students when you're teaching the farewell address. Washington would end up dying in December of 1799. And if that had happened while he had a third term as president, keep in mind the 22nd Amendment didn't exist at the time, right? Presidents could serve forever. But if he died in 1799, it would have been in the middle of his third term. And then what would it have meant? What kind of message would that have given? And hopefully your students will kind of think about it and say, wow, the presidency, people might have thought it was an office for life. I think there was a lot of wisdom in Washington stepping down, even if he was, he's had enough. He didn't want the job anyways. It did set a really important precedent that, stayed all the way until the crisis of World War II. And Franklin Roosevelt, of course, being elected 4 times, which led in part, it really just led to the 22nd Amendment in the early 1950s. So I'm going to stop there, and we can have a little bit of time for Q&A, and then we can jump into our primary sources and do even more. So Liz, I'm going to stop the share, and people can, chime in with questions you have, thoughts, ways you teach this, and Liz, I'll let you direct all that.
Yeah, we'll give everyone a few minutes to come up with some questions. Throw them in the chat.
Yeah. And if there's something that you like to teach about with Washington, or if there's a story or an incident or something we could say more about, and I'd be curious if people teach the farewell address. I guess you have to. It's in the Teaks, right? There was a time when the farewell address, it was like right up there with like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the way that it was, taught. And I think it's poll ratings have fallen to a certain extent. It's not that it's not a really important document, but it doesn't quite have the hold I think that it maybe once did.
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat. First time teacher, she says, what would be your most important takeaway from the farewell address to teach students?
Yeah, what a great question. So I'll give you the Teaks answer, and then I'll give you my answer. You definitely want to hit those points that I mentioned about the things that Washington's cautioning against, right? That he's cautioning against political parties. And he really he believed it. He was convinced that political parties really were self-interested and destructive to the republic. But I think it's fair to say by the end of his life, he's pretty partisan. He's a Federalist, definitely opposed to Jefferson's party. And then the point about America not getting involved in war, I think, is really key. But if you take some time to read the address, and it's pretty long, it's hard to share, even in the college classroom. I'll shut down. My students will shut down, I think, with the farewell address. But the key point, the thing that unites the whole thing together, that's really critical, is union, American union. That's what Washington cares the most about. And the thing he's most worried about is the fracturing of the country in different ways. And so if we think about him, making these national tours and dressing up in his uniform, giving the people the greatest hits, everything he does is really to try to keep the country together, to unite it. And then I really would ask the students, the hypothetical, what if Washington would have stayed on in a third term and not survived? What kind of message would that have sent about this new country? So, great question. I hope that helps, and have fun with it. Have fun with it. These things, they can seem a little dry, but they're a little wacky. Just pull out a few lines and and go with it.
Great. We have another couple more questions. Kathleen asked, did his message and his farewell address change much through the versions to what he finally gave in the third?
Yeah, what an excellent question. He always gives the sort of obligatory humility. It's been an honor of my life to serve the American people, and I hope I've been up to your expectations and all those things. So that's very consistent in all of these different addresses. And then, yeah, I guess that the first farewell address when he's president, the one from 1792, is a little more straightforward because some of these issues have not become to the fore yet. So you don't get you get the points about American unity, about America staying together, but you don't get the specific threats like the parties or the war. The war had not started at that point. Incidentally, some of that address does end up in the final third address. So some of the lines that were still worth keeping, which is kind of fun because Madison and Hamilton were big political rivals by that point. Madison sides with Jefferson. Um, he becomes a Jeffersonian, uh, which is an interesting thing in itself because Madison is kind of the original Federalist in terms of doing so much to create the Constitution. He was united with Hamilton in creating the Constitution, but then he ends up breaking and goes with Jefferson. So we think about all these different figures and how it plays out. It can be kind of fun with all the different rivalries and personalities.
Yeah, a comment from Elizabeth. She says, I enjoy telling my students that Washington's farewell address was a warning that others somewhat ignored. We eventually get, quote, history repeating itself. Students always ask why people didn't listen to his warning, and it leads to great class discussions.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really helpful, and I think the words can be really useful today because I think we need a little bit more of that unity in this country, right? We are so divided, and we, in some ways, we kind of have always been that way since the very start, and that's why Washington's giving the warning in the first place. We've always been a big country composed of diverse people and regions and cultures, and the trick is keeping it all together.
Another question, Liliana asks, what were his views on slavery?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. We're gonna need a whole nother workshop.
I was just
Uh,
going to say, we may need another webinar for that.
but let me give you the basic answer. So Washington is an enslaver starting at the age of 11. When Washington was 11, his father, Augustine, died, and Washington inherited his first 10 slaves at that point. And so it's something that's part of his life, from the beginning of his life to the end. And for the first half of his life, leading up to the Revolutionary War, he's a pretty normal slave owner and enslaver. He kind of follows the pattern of a normal Virginian plantation owner. He has a change of heart during the Revolutionary War. He decides that slavery is wrong, and historians, Washington doesn't open up a lot about this and tell us all the reasons why. So there's a lot of speculation, and part of it, we saw in the session last week, is that he gets out of Virginia. he spends the majority of the war in New York, and so he's in a very different environment. He also sees the heroism of African Americans in battle, including his own enslaved valet, William Lee, who's with him through the whole war. He also has the cast of Hamilton barking in his ear, including Hamilton himself, but also the Marquis de Lafayette, John Lawrence. All these younger people were anti-slavery, and I think that has an effect on Washington. The frustrating thing as a Washington scholar and as somebody who follows this is we know that he decides it's wrong, but he does nothing publicly. He does nothing to end slavery as president. And I'll talk a little bit about this with the primary sources in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Um, it takes all the way until his will, which he writes in July of 1799, the summer before he died, where he freed the people that he owned at Mount Vernon. He didn't have control over Martha Washington's family, the Custis family slaves. So he frees, just under half of the people there. They were to be freed upon Martha Washington's death. She decides after about a year that she'll free those people. And so this was a pretty remarkable thing for the time, but it's still frustrating because it feels like it was too little, too late, and that someone that had so much political capital maybe could have had a bigger difference with the issue. So it's a fascinating thing to study, and I'm glad you asked the question.
I think we have one more question, and before we move into our document session, Becky asks,
Okay.
how does Washington really feel about Hamilton's financial plan for the US?
Yeah, I don't know. We got to do the seance, George. How do you really feel? I think all the evidence points to the fact that Washington really agreed with it. The Hamilton song. There's a great song that wouldn't it be nice to have Washington on your side, and Hamilton and Washington on his side. And Jefferson, this frustrates Jefferson to no end. And Jefferson always thinks that Hamilton is taking advantage of Washington somehow, especially as Washington ages, and that Washington is, becoming kind of senile, and that he just doesn't know any better. Because if he knew any better, he wouldn't agree with Hamilton. But when you look at the evidence, Washington is really kind of a proto-industrialist. He thinks a lot like a Northerner. He's interested in machines. He's interested in building an industrial economy. Um, Jefferson, taking a remark from somebody else, kind of a secondhand remark, records once that if there were to be a civil war, and they're already thinking about this in the 1790s, if the North and the South split, that Washington would go with the North. And that kind of shows, I think, his economic thinking. The real test comes with the bank, the national bank. He asks all his cabinet members, is this constitutional? Is this something we can do? And Hamilton comes back and says, yes, absolutely. That the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, also known as the elastic clause, makes this perfectly okay. Jefferson comes back and says, absolutely not. This is not constitutional. We can't do this. And Washington seems to genuinely agree with Hamilton on all these questions, which is really, really fascinating. So I hope that helps. Really, really good question.
Great. Do we want to open up your resource presentation?
Yeah,
Great.
let's do it. Let's keep on rolling. All right, so we're going to move into the documents now. And like last week, I have another little slide presentation for us. Share. Let me get that there. Let's start from the beginning. All right, so these are the primary sources. And so you all have copies of these, of the full documents, and you guys are the experts. You know what your students can handle and what you might share of these various things. And I'll show you just some things that I'd like to highlight. And I'd love you to, just like last week, I'll ask some questions and you can respond in the chat. And we'll take a little bit of time to talk about each of these things. So we'll start with dessert first. We'll start with a picture. And I mentioned that this is kind of the image that Washington lands on as the head of state, the head of the American state. It's my favorite painting of Washington. It's done by Gilbert Stuart. Gilbert Stuart does the Athenaeum, portrait of Washington, which becomes the $1 bill. Today we use that painting. There's two original copies of this painting. One is in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. It's been restored in the last couple of years, and it's really beautiful. The other copy is in the White House, in the East Room of the White House. And you might know the story from the War of 1812 when the British came to burn Washington in August of 1814. Dolly Madison, along with a servant and an enslaved man, managed to save the portrait of Washington before the White House is burned. And so that is there as well. And what I would love for you to do in the chat is just share some things that jump out at you in this painting. Don't worry right now about like explaining them. We don't need to know what they all mean just now, but what are you curious about? Or what do you see that you think you might have some meaning, or what's just weird? What's weird about this painting? So go ahead and write your comments, and I'm gonna follow them here. Um, Good. So Lindsay, I've always wondered what he's pointing at. Excellent. Student sentence. Doesn't look like a general. He's sold out. He's become a politician. I have a political science friend here at GW who says the best evidence that George Washington was a great politician is that he's never known as a politician. He's always known as a general. All right. Good. Keep him coming. This is great. All right, this is so good. So keep going. I'm just going to kind of address some of these, and other folks feel free to chat some answers too. Like if you have some analysis, if you have some if you have some thoughts about these, share that as well. Lindsay's question, I wonder what he's pointing at. Um, I'm going to give you my perspective on this. The great thing about art history compared to history, you can make stuff up in art history. that's my that's my joke to art historians. That, you're interpreting the painting as long as it's grounded in some kind of evidence, right? It's okay. Um, Maybe that's one reason it's a little more freeing than some written documents. But I think this is a very sort of Republican move, right? That is very welcoming. It's almost like an open. If we imagine King George III, his coronation portrait, you wouldn't see him doing this. He's more kind of like standoffish. And yeah, he does look definitely like he's become a full president here. Look at Maria's comment. Uh, Collins, is he welcoming us or showing us the door? Yeah. See, you can have your own interpretation of this. Washington's had enough. Um, the comment from Jennifer about the rainbow, I think, is a great one. So this is a two weather pattern painting. It's a twofer. If you look at the two windows, the two images of the outside, the one is kind of darker clouds, kind of storm clouds, and then you get the rainbow. And the usual interpretation of this is that you have the Revolutionary War and the difficulties creating the new American Union, and then you have the payoff, the benefit, the future, the rainbow. So that's kind of what we are. We're the future. We're the rainbow there. All right, let's see what else. All right, so I'm gonna take a couple of them together. The quill on the table and the books underneath are really important. And I should have done like a close-up, a detail of the books. But the books are important because they include a history of the American Revolution. There's the thing about American laws, and we think that the Constitution is part of these books. And the message there is that the authority of the American president rests on law. It's not arbitrary. It's not based on birth like the monarchies in Europe. So there's an important message there. Well, I say that I would love people to type in the chat. Um, is there anything in this painting that looks a little bit kingly to you that might be a little bit off? Is there anything that doesn't quite seem very Republican? And as I asked that question, look what I see. Kathleen wrote, "Chair looks like a throne." Yes, it does, right? And that red velvet, right, feels like very monarchical. Um, the the thing that looks like a cane, that's actually a sword. That's a dress sword. And that's another part of the message about, I think, Republican government. It's a civilian sword. Even though he had been a general, this is kind of the civilian side of things. And so it kind of shows the civilian control of the military, the same thing that he had represented in the Revolutionary War. Um, yeah, this is great. Really royal looking background, symbols of Rome, absolutely. Um, and it's never bad to steal from the John Adams miniseries. It's very good. Uh, the feather in the hat. Yeah, I don't. That's a good one. I don't know about the. That is a hat in the background. I don't know the full story about the decorations with it, but I think you guys hit all the big ones here. And the historian Gordon Wood has referred to George Washington as a royal monarch, a Republican monarch. That he's still he's a very Republican figure, but we have to keep in mind that his model of the executive was the monarchy. That's what existed at the time, and so you kind of see those elements in this painting. So I'm going to move on to a really important document, maybe the most important letter from Washington's presidency, and it's written to this woman. Her name was Catherine McCullough, and then her married name Catherine McCullough Graham. She was a very famous British historian, and she was a Republican in Britain. She wrote about the English Civil War, the 1640s, and the kind of like um, enemy of sorts in her writings was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was the opposite of Washington. He was someone who had fought for a republic, but then it turned into a dictatorship, didn't give up power. So she is fascinated by George Washington and the American Revolution. And she's the first English supporter of the Americans to come to America after the independence. She tours the different states and she stayed at Mount Vernon for, I think, about 10 days. Here's another image of her. And so Washington writes this letter to her. There's a lot of text here, but he writes this letter to her um, in January of 1790, and this is a day after his State of the Union, which had been on January the 8th. So this is kind of in the midpoint of his first year as president. And my question I want you to kind of write some answers to in the chat and to think about is he doesn't seem as humble as he did in the things that we read last week. Um, and I'll just give you a few examples of this. So he says at the very top that the establishment of our new government seemed to be the last great experiment for promoting human happiness by reasonable compact in civil society. Um, and he goes on, and I wonder why. Like, why do you think he's kind of showing off a little bit? I'll give you a few other examples. He says, um, he's talking about his own role in all of this. And he says, all see and most admire the glare which hovers around the external trappings of elevated office. To me, there is nothing in it beyond the luster which may be reflected from its connection with the power of promoting human felicity, or happiness. Um, and and he says, in our progress towards political happiness, my station is new. And if I may use the expression, I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any action whose motives may not be subject to a double interpretation. There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent. So these are the most famous words. I walk on untrodden ground. So I wonder again, like, what any idea about why you think he's saying, "Hey, we've done really good here. We pulled it off." Why he might be kind of gloating a little bit to Catherine McCullough Graham. I'll give you a second to think about that. Any guesses are welcome. In the history happy hour, a guess is as good as a good answer. Great. Good. So we have a few great ideas here. Lindsay says that he seems less fearful. might be looking at that kind of successes at this point and favorably. I think that's absolutely right. That I think he's kind of reached a point of safety here, right? They've launched this new government, and it seems to be working. And he was very afraid the revolution was going to fail, but now I think there's a little bit more hope. Um, and I love Kathleen and Liliana's ideas as well. That he's kind of saying, yeah, again, that we managed to pull this off. And think about who he's talking to. It's a British person, but it's a friend of his, but he admires her very much. She's a famous writer. She's a famous Republican. She hated royal government. And so I think he's trying to say that, even though we created this new office with the Constitution, that we're still managing to pull off this republicanism very well. Um, and in the very last lines you see here, and this is actually the last lines of the letters, the ellipses show it's a longer letter, but he writes, Mrs. Washington is well and desires her compliments may be presented to you. Her wishes coincide with my own as to the simplicity of dress and everything which can tend to support propriety of character without partaking of the follies of luxury and ostentation. So in other words, I don't dress like Furry George does, right? I'm not like a monarch. I wear my ripped jeans, and we keep things more simple in this republic. And he really wants her approval, which I find really fascinating. Um, uh, so, anyways, well, we'll keep moving because we have a lot of great things. So we talked about this visit to Rhode Island and to the Touro Synagogue, which is this beautiful building. And I want to highlight really the most important part of this letter. Um, Oh, it went away. No, we don't want that. That's cheating. We want the real thing. Okay. So we're gonna have everybody take a line. No, I'm just kidding. So if we start right here where my cursor is, most famous part of this, and he's writing to this congregation, and they've asked him if they're gonna have religious liberty. And he says, it is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection shall demean themselves as good citizens. Whew, I passed the cursive writing test. So let's skip ahead and look at this right here. This is those same words right here, and I love that comment. Beautiful penmanship. Yeah, it's pretty easy to read that compared to a lot of primary sources that you might look at. So quick question, and so the big question here is if you look at this language, there's going to be no no bigotry, no persecution. Does it surprise you that a slave owner is writing these words? And how might we compare or think about why he would be so progressive on the issue of religious liberty, which he is, while still being an enslaver and harboring racial views that we're clearly, but by our standards, very very racist. Any ideas about that? Kind of the difference that you see here. Um, Good. So part of it is that enslaved people are, just they're considered property, a totally different class of people. Absolutely. Um, and Washington, I think, grows in a certain sense during the revolution, like I talked about. I think he's able to start to see African Americans as people. Um, um, but um, but yeah, for most plantation owners, they're absolutely property. The other sort of big thing I guess I would think about, and this gets at that same question that Kathleen asked, is the issue of race, right? That Washington's not able to get past the issue of race. He is able to get past the issue of religious difference, I think, which is really significant, and we see in this. If you teach this, I think an important thing to point out, and you might do this with your students, you might ask them, would you feel any less of George Washington if you knew he was mostly quoting a letter that the Jewish congregation in Newport wrote to him? because in fact, that's what he was doing. So if we look at the next document, this is the bonus document for the History Happy Hour, not part of your original collection. But this shows a letter the day before that the congregation wrote to George Washington. And you can see those words, to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution, no assistance. So we have to be sure to credit, the congregation with coming up with these phrases, and also give credit to George Washington for repeating them, but they weren't necessarily words that he invented. A lot of people miss that with this source. Okay, so let's keep on rolling. We got one last one, and I talked about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. That's the only major thing that Washington did in terms of slavery as president. And it really was meant to strengthen the institution. It reinforced the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, which basically said that, enslaved laborers, although they don't use the word slave, but they mean it, couldn't run away. They couldn't leave. And this is a problem that Washington faced, as a plantation owner and even as president. He took somewhere between 6 to 8 enslaved people with him to New York and Philadelphia for the executive residences, including the woman, Ona Judge, who would famously run away in 1796. And we're used to seeing some kind of strange things from the American presidency, but this is really, really, really out there, right? The American president writes a runaway slave ad, and it says absconded from the household of the president of the United States, Oni Judge, and then goes on to describe her. So this is a something that Washington faced. If you want to learn more about Ona Judge, there's great resources from the historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar. She wrote a full book for adults called Never Caught, about Ona Judge, and there's also young adult versions of the book. What I want to reflect on is part of the context of why Ona Judge ran away from Philadelphia. And it has to do with this letter right here. There was an existing law in Pennsylvania that if enslaved people were brought into the state, this is after 1780, after Pennsylvania passes an emancipation law. But if enslaved people were brought into the state, if they stayed longer than 6 months, they became free. And so he writes this letter, George Washington writes this letter to his personal secretary, Tobias Lear, about what they're going to do about this, since they have slaves in Philadelphia. And he basically comes up with this idea of rotating them between Philadelphia and Mount Vernon every 6 months. And if you look really closely at this, he says that this idea that he comes up with, he says, I wish to have it accomplished under pretext that may deceive both them and the public. I request that these sentiments and this advice may be known to none but yourself and Mrs. Washington. And I just think that this is really important to share, because it gives a full picture of Washington and shows, as president, that he remains a slave owner, and famously didn't tell lies, but in this case is saying very, very clearly we have to deceive people in doing this. And so I think the challenge today, I think, is to teach students the full picture of these different figures. And so I hope this document helps you do that. I realize that we are running a little short on time, so I got to get in my big font thank you to all of you, because I've enjoyed this so much, and I love all the comments that you've shared, and especially the fact that you're able to use this. That makes me really happy. I'm a friend of Humanities Texas, and you always feel free to reach out to me if I can do anything for you or your students.